Mary Poppins in the Park. Chapter 1. Every Goose a Swan. The summer day was hot and still. The cherry trees that bordered the lane could feel their cherries ripening, the green slowly turning to yellow, and the yellow blushing red. The houses dozed in their dusty gardens with their shutters over their eyes. "Don't disturb us," they seemed to say. "We rest in the afternoon." And the starlings hid themselves in the chimneys, with their heads under their wings. Over the park lay a cloud of sunlight as thick and golden as syrup. No wind stirred the heavy leaves. The flowers stood up, very still and shiny, as though they were made of metal. Down by the lake, the benches were empty. The people who usually sat there had gone home out of the heat. Neleus, the little marble statue, looked down at the placid water. No goldfish flirted a scarlet tail. They were all sitting under the lily leaves, using them as umbrellas. The lawn spread out like a green carpet, motionless in the sunlight. Except for a single rhythmic movement, you might have thought the whole park was only a painted picture. To and fro by the big magnolia, the park keeper was spearing up rubbish and putting it into the litter basket. He stopped his work and looked up as two dogs trotted by. They had come from Cherry Tree Lane, he knew, for Miss Lark was calling from behind her shutters. "Andrew, Willoughby, please come back. Don't go swimming in that dirty lake. I'll make you some iced tea." Andrew and Willoughby looked at each other, winked, and trotted on. But as they passed the big magnolia, they started and pulled up sharply. Down they flopped on the grass, panting with their pink tongues lolling out. Mary Poppins, neat and trim in her blue skirt, a new hat trimmed with a crimson tulip, looked at them over her knitting. She was sitting bolt upright against the tree, with a plaid rug spread on the lawn around her. Her handbag sat tidily by her side, and above her, from a flowering branch, the parrot umbrella dangled. She glanced at the two thumping tails and gave a little sniff. "Put in your tongues and sit up straight. You are not a pair of wolves." The two dogs sprang at once to attention, and Jane, lying on the lawn, could see that they were doing their very best to put their tongues in their cheeks. "And remember, if you're going swimming," Mary Poppins continued, "to shake yourselves when you come out. Don't come sprinkling us." Andrew and Willoughby looked reproachful. "As though," Mary Poppins, they seemed to say, "we would dream of such a thing." "All right, then, be off with you," and they sped away like shots from a gun. "Come back," Miss Lark called anxiously, but nobody took any notice. "Why can't I swim in Park Lake?" asked Michael in a smothered voice. He was lying face downward in the grass, watching a family of ants. "You're not a dog," Mary Poppins reminded him. "I know, Mary Poppins, but if I were—" Was she smiling or not? He couldn't be sure, with his nose pressed into the earth. "Well, what would you do?" she inquired with a sniff. He wanted to say that if he were a dog, he would do just as he liked, swim or not, as the mood took him, without asking leave of anyone. But what if her face was looking fierce? Silence was best, he decided. "Nothing," he said in a meek voice. "It's too hot to argue, Mary Poppins." "Out of nothing comes nothing." She tossed her head in its tulip hat. "And I'm not arguing, I'm talking." She was having the last word, as usual. The sunlight caught her knitting needles as it shone through the broad magnolia leaves and on the little group below. John and Barbara, leaning their hands on each other's shoulders, were dozing and waking and dozing. Annabelle was fast asleep in Mary Poppins' shadow. Light and darkness dappled them all, and splotched the face of the park keeper as he dived at a piece of newspaper. "All litter to be placed in baskets. Obey the rules," he said sternly. Mary Poppins looked him up and down. Her glance would have withered an oak tree. "That's not my litter," she retorted. "Oh," he said disbelievingly. "No," she replied with a virtuous snort. "Well, someone must have put it there. It doesn't grow like roses." He pushed his cap to the back of his head and mopped behind his ears. What with the heat and her tone of voice, he was feeling quite depressed. "Hot weather we're having," he remarked, eyeing her nervously. He looked like an eager, lonely dog. "That's what we expect in the middle of summer." Her knitting needles clicked. The park keeper sighed and tried again. "I see you brought your parrot," he said, glancing up at the black silk shape that hung among the leaves. "You mean my parrot-headed umbrella," she haughtily corrected him. He gave a little anxious laugh. "You don't think it's going to rain, do you, with all this sun about?" "I don't think I know," she told him calmly. And if I, she went on, were a park keeper, I wouldn't be wasting half the day like some people I could mention. There's a piece of orange peel over there. Why don't you pick it up? She pointed with her knitting needle and kept it pointed accusingly, while she speared up the offering litter and tossed it into a basket. If she was me, he said to himself, there'd be no park at all, only a nice tidy desert. He fanned his face with his cap. And anyway, he said aloud, it's no fault of mine. I'm a park keeper. I should have been an explorer by rights, away in foreign parts. If I'd had me way, I wouldn't be here. I'd be sitting on a piece of ice, along with a polar bear. He sighed and leaned upon his stick, falling into a daydream. Humph, said Mary Poppins loudly, and a startled dove in the tree above her rustled its wing in surprise. A feather came slowly drifting down. Jane stretched out her hand and caught it. How deliciously it tickles, she murmured, rubbing the gray edge over her nose. Then she tucked the feather above her brow and bound her ribbon round it. I'm the daughter of the Indian chief Minnehaha, laughing water gliding along the river. Oh, no, you're not, corrected Michael. You're Jane Caroline Banks. That's only my outside, she insisted. Inside, I'm somebody quite different. It's a very funny feeling. You should have eaten a bigger lunch. Then you wouldn't have funny feelings, and Daddy's not an Indian chief, so you can't be Minnehaha. He gave a sudden start as he spoke and peered more closely up into the grass. There he goes, he shouted, wriggling forward on his stomach and thumping with his toes. Oh, thank you, Michael, said Mary Poppins, to stop kicking my shins. What are you, a performing horse? Not a horse, a hunter, Mary Poppins. I'm tracking in the jungle. Jungles, scoffed the park keeper. My vote is for snowy wastes. If you're not careful, Michael Banks, you'll be tracking home to bed. I never knew such a silly pair. And you're the third, snapped Mary Poppins, eyeing the park keeper, always wanting to be something else instead of what you are. If it's not Miss Minnie What's-Her-Name, it's this or that or the other. You're as bad as the Goose Girl and the swineherd. But it isn't geese or swine I'm after, it's a lion, Mary Poppins. He may be only an ant on the outside, but inside, at last I've got him. Inside, he's a man-eater. Michael rolled over, red in the face, holding something small and black between his finger and thumb. Jane, he began in an eager voice, but the sentence was never finished, for Jane was making signs to him, and he turned to Mary Poppins and understood their meaning. As he turned to Mary Poppins, he understood their meaning. Her knitting had fallen on the rug, and her hands were folded in her lap. She was looking at something far away, beyond the lane, beyond the park, perhaps beyond the horizon. Carefully, so as not to disturb her, the children crept to her side. The park keeper plumped himself down on the rug and stared at her, goggle-eyed. Yes, Mary Poppins, prompted Jane, the Goose Girl. Tell us about her. Michael pressed against her skirt and waited expectantly. He could feel her legs, bony and strong, beneath the cool blue linen. From under the shadow of her hat, she glanced at them for a short moment and looked away again. Well, there she sat, she began gravely, speaking in soft accents that were so unlike her usual voice. There she sat, day after day, amid her flock of geese, braiding her hair and unbraiding it for lack of something to do. Sometimes she would pick a fern and wave it before her like a fan, the way the Lord Chancellor's wife might do, or even the Queen, maybe. Or again, she would wave a necklace of flowers and go to the brook and admire it. And every time she did that, she noticed that her eyes were blue, bluer than any periwinkle, and her cheeks like the breast of a robin. As for her mouth, not to mention her nose, her opinion of these was so high that she had no words fit to describe them. She sounds like you, Mary Poppins, said Michael, so terribly pleased with herself. Her glance came darting from the horizon and flickered at him fiercely. I mean, Mary Poppins, he began to stammer. Had he broken the thread of the story? I mean, he went on flatteringly, you've got pink cheeks and blue eyes too, like lollipops and bluebells. A smile of satisfaction melted her angry look, and Michael gave a sigh of relief as she took up the tale again. And we will pause there.